Nathan is Lorraine's adult son. He tried to take over a valuable apartment building that originally belonged to his mother. He used fake documents to get loans and power, thinking Lorraine was too old or weak to stop him. But Lorraine, quietly and strategically, reclaimed ownership of the building using legal tools, old deeds, LLCs, and forgotten investments. In the hook scene, Nathan brings a folder, thinking he has one last move to control the situation. Lorraine doesn't panic. She flips through the papers and reveals he actually has no power left. Not even his name is on the documents anymore. The tenants, who Nathan and his partner tried to evict, are now cheering for Lorraine, the woman they trust. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. When someone calls you a relic, they usually say it behind your back, not across the Thanksgiving table, and not with a wine glass in hand. Lorraine Whitmore didn't flinch. She simply folded her napkin once, slowly, and placed it on her lap. Her smile was practiced, polite, and utterly unreadable, like porcelain left on a shelf too long to betray a single crack. Across the long, gleaming oak table in her son Nathan's modern open-plan dining room, Curtis leaned back in his chair with all the swagger of a man too used to hearing his own voice. "I mean, no offense," he added with a chuckle, "but your mom's like, I don't know, a relic from another era. Still uses paper ledgers and fountain pens, right?" He turned to the others as if waiting for applause. A few guests gave the kind of chuckles people offer when they don't want to pick a side. One of Nathan's colleagues took a long sip of Pinot Noir to avoid eye contact. Lorraine didn't look at Curtis. She looked at Nathan. He didn't defend her. He just adjusted his collar and changed the subject. The dinner went on like that, well-plated, poorly tempered. Stuffing passed, laughter echoed, and Lorraine sat there, a phantom at the edge of her son's curated life. From the spotless kitchen island to the minimalist wall art, nothing in this home remembered her. Not the recipes she once taught him, not the lace runners she'd crocheted for the first apartment he shared with Amanda, not even a photo of his father. But it was the building that stung most. Nathan now managed the apartment complex Lorraine had purchased with her late husband in 1986, back when they still checked plumbing themselves and knew every tenant's name. The deed had eventually transferred under Nathan's LLC. For efficiency, he'd claimed. Lorraine had agreed at the time. After James passed, everything felt like too much to hold alone. Now, as Curtis poured more wine, Lorraine caught pieces of a conversation happening 2 seats down. "Thinking we demo that back wing. Strip it, upscale it," Curtis said. "Get some real tenants in, you know, people who matter now." Lorraine looked at the roast on her plate, untouched. She wasn't sure whether it was hunger or history that turned her stomach. Later, coats were fetched. Guests filtered out. The dining room echoed with the soft clatter of dishes and distant laughter from the living room. Lorraine stood, smoothed her blouse, and murmured, "I should be heading out." "Already?" Nathan asked, glancing up from his phone. "It's been a long day. I'll call you an Uber." "I can walk." He didn't insist. The air outside was crisp and bitter, the kind of November chill that makes every breath feel earned. Lorraine walked slowly, heels clicking against uneven sidewalk slabs, her coat belt tied neatly at the waist. She didn't cry. She didn't replay the insult. She simply arrived home, turned on the foyer lamp, and crossed the room with the deliberate grace of a woman who once taught public speaking and had outlasted every man who told her to smile more. She opened the hall closet and reached for the lockbox behind a row of vacuum-sealed sweaters. The key was on a thin silver chain tucked into the lining of her purse. 10 minutes later, she was at her local bank. The clerk barely glanced up as she signed the log and disappeared into the vault. When the safe deposit box slid toward her, Lorraine opened it with the same care she once reserved for love letters and ledger sheets. Inside was a single manila folder. She pulled it out, closed the lid, and whispered aloud to no one, "Let's see what the old era left behind." She flipped the tab. It read, "Old era assets." The past doesn't fade. It waits in columns, ledgers, and land records, like a ghost with paperwork. Lorraine sat at her dining table with the folder spread open in front of her, yellowed documents fluttering slightly from the breeze of a cracked window. The smell of ink, dust, and decades-old leather bindings lingered in the air. A steaming mug of Earl Grey sat untouched beside her, slowly going cold. Each page she turned whispered something back. Dividends received, mortgage notes paid off, propias, RT sales marked in crisp typewriter ink. There was her signature again and again in the corner of forms now forgotten by everyone but time. Then she found it. A single sheet of paper, folded once. The LLC name was printed in blue block font. Whitmore Holdings, Incorporated. Her name, Lorraine M. Whitmore, managing partner, was printed just below. She stared at it for a long moment. She hadn't seen that name in over 20 years. It was one of the legal vehicles she and her late husband had set up in the 90s for tax protection, mostly used to hold real estate and royalties from a brief stint James had advising local manufacturing firms. They hadn't dissolved it, only frozen it, and it was still legally alive. The next morning, she stepped into the notary's office, a small windowless space tucked between a tax consultant and a locksmith downtown. It smelled like toner and old carpet glue. The woman behind the counter barely looked up. "I need to reactivate this entity," Lorraine said, sliding the paperwork forward. The notary took a glance, then raised an eyebrow. "This goes back. You sure?" Lorraine smiled faintly. "Very sure." With 2 signatures, a new seal, and a $28 fee, Whitmore Holdings stirred awake. Back in her apartment, she pulled up Nathan and Curtis's new development website. Sleek, cold, self-congratulatory. Their corporate baby was called Next Line Developments, and the words "revitalizing urban spaces for a modern generation" floated across the screen in looping white text over drone-shot footage of up-and-coming neighborhoods. Buried 3 clicks deep, she found the permit filings, lot numbers, unit designations, phasing schedules. There was even a projected date for tenant removal, but that's when she noticed it. Parcel 117C. It was the south wing, the oldest part of the building, the part James had always called ours. She went to the filing cabinet and found the original deed. There it was, in clean serif font, ownership, Whitmore Holdings, 50%, co-signature clause required for sale or transfer. Her breath caught in her throat, but she didn't gasp. She just read it again, slower. They had built their project on stolen ground and never even noticed. Lorraine picked up her phone and called Dana. Dana Levine had been her friend and former legal advisor for years, smart, discreet, and still practiced part-time for friends who knew not to waste her time. When Lorraine arrived with the folder, Dana opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the deed, the LLC reactivation, the development filings. 5 minutes passed before she leaned back in her chair and said, "Lorraine, I don't think they know what you still own." Lorraine didn't blink. "That's what I'm counting on." Dana tapped the paper once, thoughtfully. "You don't want to tip them off yet." "I won't. But I'm not letting them take one more brick without knowing who laid the first stone." That evening, Lorraine sat at her desk and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, she wrote one word at the top in block letters. TENANTS. She would start there, one by one. Before the bulldozers came for history, she'd make sure it knew who still held the keys. Modern men build towers of glass, forgetting some women own the land beneath. Lorraine stood quietly just beyond the reach of the courtyard lighting where the shadows didn't ask questions. Around her, the familiar space had been transformed into a showroom for ambition. White string lights hung above cocktail tables. Soft jazz floated from a rented speaker. A pop-up bar served overpriced drinks to a crowd of polished smiles and tailored suits. At the center of it all was Curtis, his sport coat 2 shades too bold for the occasion, and his laugh just loud enough to demand attention. He held a glass of something amber and theatrical as he addressed a ring of eager investors. "This south wing," he said, gesturing with his glass, "will be the crown jewel. All of it's getting redone. Modern materials, luxury amenities, tenant upgrades. This place has good bones, sure, but it needs new blood." A few heads nodded. Laughter followed, small and artificial, the kind that floats just above discomfort. Lorraine watched him from a distance, saying nothing. She knew this building better than any of them. She could still see the outline of the old rose garden where they now stood sipping bourbon. Nathan stood off to the side, speaking with a real estate blogger who was half his age and already halfway out of the conversation. Lorraine caught the tail end of his sentence as she passed close enough to hear. "My mom's too sentimental to understand real estate," he was saying. "She still uses ledgers and paper deeds. It's like she thinks nostalgia pays rent." The blogger offered a thin smile. Nathan chuckled, unaware of the shadow that paused just behind the column. Lorraine didn't interrupt. She walked on. Inside, the building still smelled like itself, plaster, old carpet, and something warm left behind, and by the generations who'd called it home. The stairwell hadn't been updated in decades, which meant no security cameras and no broken elevators to wait for. Lorraine moved floor to floor, a notebook tucked under one arm, making her way quietly through the halls. At Unit 3C, a young boy opened the door. He looked up, eyes wide. "Are you Miss Lorraine?" he asked, barefoot in Pokemon pajamas. She smiled. "Yes, I am. Thanks for the banana bread last month," he said. "Mom says it helped her get through the double shift." Lorraine gently touched his shoulder and asked to say hello to his mother. She was asleep, so the boy waved and closed the door, promising to tell her. She made a note beside 3C. Single mother, night shifts, 2 kids, respectful, long-term tenant. Unit by unit, she worked through the building, speaking softly where she could, listening more than she spoke. People remembered her. More importantly, they trusted her. And what she heard chilled her. Rent had quietly risen nearly 15% in under a year. Routine maintenance requests were being ignored. Tenants were told their leases wouldn't be renewed. Just vague phrases like transition planning and redevelopment alignment. Lorraine marked every story, every concern, every detail that would matter later. When she reached Unit 4B, she paused before knocking. She knew the couple inside. Marisol and George had lived there since 1982. Their wedding photo still hung beside the door just behind the peephole. Marisol opened it wearing a house dress and the same gold locket Lorraine remembered from church picnics 30 years ago. "They're asking us to leave," Marisol said quietly, inviting her in. "Said our unit was flagged for early phase restructuring, offered us a signing bonus to vacate within 30 days. George handed Lorraine the letter. It was printed on stiff white cardstock with the Next Line logo embossed at the top. The wording was vague, but the message was clear. "They said if we signed the NDA we'd get 2 months' rent and no trouble," George added. Lorraine opened her notebook. "Don't sign anything just yet," she said, calm but firm. She stayed long enough to sip tea and hear their fears. Before leaving, she hugged Marisol tightly and looked George in the eye. "I promise," she said, "you're not invisible to me." She climbed the last flight to her own unit, the notebook now half filled with names and notes. The hallway was quiet, but the air felt different, charged. Something waited for her at the door. It was an envelope, taped neatly to the center of her unit. Thick cardstock again. Same logo. She peeled it off slowly and read the top line aloud. "Notice of Tenancy Review, Whitmore, Unit 2. A." Her fingers tightened around the paper, but she didn't tear it. Instead, she stepped inside, turned on the hallway light, and added a final note to her book. "Now they're coming for me, too." A woman's voice may be quiet, but her paperwork roars. Lorraine stepped into the county records building just after 9 a.m., her gray wool coat clutched at the neck, a leather document case balanced carefully under one arm. The lobby smelled of toner, old carpet, and stale government coffee. A buzzing fluorescent light overhead flickered like it hadn't slept either. She moved with the posture of someone who had spent her life standing straight in front of chalkboards and budget meetings, calm, composed, with a quiet kind of precision. At the front desk sat a young clerk, maybe 24, in a zip-up hoodie under his county badge. He looked up from his phone without moving his neck. "Can I help you?" Lorraine opened her case and withdrew 3 manila folders, each marked in blue ink with years, 1986 to 1992, original deeds, and joint holdings. I'm here to request records confirmation on a parcel, Block 17, Parcel C, registered originally under Whitmore Holdings, Incorporated. The clerk blinked. You mean the old apartment block on Shelbourne? She nodded once. South Wing. He chuckled lightly. That was folded into a development deal last year. I think it's under next line now. Lorraine didn't flinch. That's what I'm here to dispute. The clerk's eyebrows arched, amusement twitching across his face. Ma'am, most of those old filings were converted digitally. It's not really something people contest anymore. She slid the folders forward, opening one to the notarized deed with her name in thick, unmistakable ink, Lorraine M. Whitmore, managing partner, 50% ownership. The county seal still shimmered in the corner, slightly raised under the decades of preservation. The clerk stared at it, then looked back at her. One moment, please. He disappeared into the back office without another word. 15 minutes later, a supervisor emerged. Older, sharper, his suit more ironed. He held the deed between gloved fingers like something fragile and potentially explosive. You've had this the whole time? He asked, glancing between Lorraine and the document. It was never transferred, and it was never nullified. Her voice remained even. I have the full paper trail. Technically, the supervisor said slowly, this portion of the property can't be legally altered without co-signature or full buyout, neither of which have been filed. Lorraine gave a small, satisfied nod. Then I'd like to file an injunction. The supervisor raised an eyebrow. To freeze the current permits? To pause any demolition or eviction activity tied to Parcel C, she clarified, until we can clarify what else they forgot to read. By noon, the injunction had been filed. A messenger would deliver it by certified courier to both the city zoning department and the offices of Nextline Developments. At 3:42 p.m., Lorraine's phone rang. It was Nathan. She let it buzz twice before answering. You really filed an injunction against me? His voice was thin, taut, almost disbelieving. Do you have any idea how this makes me look? Lorraine sat at her kitchen table, the document case resting beside a half-drunk cup of tea. I didn't do it for appearances. You're sabotaging everything we've worked for, he snapped. No, she said quietly. You're trying to sell a future that was never yours to begin with. There was a beat of silence. Then, without another word, Nathan hung up. Lorraine didn't call him back. That evening, she set out 37 envelopes on her dining table. Each one bore the name of a tenant in her building, written in her handwriting, clear, deliberate, the same way she used to sign progress reports as a school administrator. She tucked a letter into each envelope. The contents were straightforward but powerful. A notification that the demolition permit had been paused, that legal action was underway, and, most crucially, that according to the original building charter, tenants held the right to a buyback clause should a majority ownership transfer ever be contested. It was an obscure clause, long buried in legal language, but it gave the tenants something no one else had bothered to offer them: standing. She sealed each envelope by hand. No postage. She would deliver them herself. The last one she slid into its sleeve was addressed to Marisol and George in Unit 4B. On the top of each letter, printed in bold type, was the title, What They Didn't Tell You. Men who speak over women forget that some of us write the minutes. The conference room smelled faintly of wood polish, synthetic lavender, and nervous anticipation. Floor-to-ceiling glass framed the skyline like a threat, Nextline's signature aesthetic. Lorraine stepped in slowly, her heels clicking against marble tile as conversations tapered off mid-sentence. Heads turned. She was not expected. She was not invited. But she was allowed. Curtis, seated at the head of the polished table, looked up from his notes and offered a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well, this is unexpected. I'm here as a stakeholder, Lorraine said simply, removing her gloves one finger at a time before folding them neatly and placing them beside her leather folio. Curtis blinked as if she'd spoken a foreign language. Lorraine, this is a strategic planning session. The legal team handles stake notifications. It's not really... She's within her rights. interrupted a sharp voice from the far end of the table. It was Nextline's corporate attorney, a woman in her 40s who hadn't looked up once since Lorraine entered. Her share was never bought out or absorbed. Her LLC is active and the original documents confirm it. She's entitled to speak and to vote. Curtis's mouth twitched. He laughed, but it came out like static. Okay, fine, we're all about inclusivity. Lorraine didn't respond. She simply opened her folio, retrieved a single-page document, and laid it face up in front of her. I'm submitting a motion, she said, voice calm, to repurchase my original stake at current market value, with full access to land rights and restoration clauses. The room fell so still, even the HVAC seemed to pause. Nathan, sitting 2 chairs down from Curtis, turned pale. You're offering to buy back your piece of the project? He asked slowly, disbelief thick in his voice. Correct. Where would you even... He stopped himself, but his tone finished the question. Where would someone like you get that kind of money? Lorraine smiled faintly. From people who don't dismiss experience. She let the silence stretch, then added, I've secured private backing. Quietly, patiently, as women tend to do when men are busy speaking. Curtis stood, walked to the whiteboard, and began flipping through marketing slides with too much speed. This is all symbolic, obviously. Legacy participation is charming, but we have a vision, one that reflects the future. You can build whatever vision you want, Lorraine replied, just not on land that doesn't legally belong to you, at least not without a vote. Curtis turned. Then let's vote. There were 5 official seats on the board. Curtis and Nathan had 2, Lorraine held 1, the last 2 belonged to outside investors, one of whom, an older man named Franklin, had shown up in person today, his cane resting against the leg of his chair. I vote no, Curtis said firmly. I vote yes, Lorraine answered. Nathan looked between them, beads of sweat forming at his temple. I abstain, he said quietly. That left Franklin. I think it's interesting, he muttered, stroking his chin. You know, when I started in property management, a woman in my office once saved us from 3 lawsuits in 1 quarter. Never raised her voice. Just pointed out every detail we missed. People laughed at her, too. He looked over at Lorraine. I abstain. Curtis exhaled sharply, as if the room had betrayed him. Lorraine gathered her papers without a word. She hadn't expected a win today. She didn't need one yet. She only needed the room to understand that she wasn't going anywhere. As she stepped into the elevator, her phone buzzed. It was a number with an area code she hadn't seen in over 2 decades. The text read, Still want that offer from 1993? Lorraine stared at it, unmoving, as the elevator doors slid shut. 20 years ago, she hadn't needed the offer. Now? She smiled. And hit reply. Some investments don't pay in dividends, they pay in doors opening. Lorraine sat on the floor of her bedroom, legs crossed beneath her in soft house pants. An old shoebox opened in front of her like a time capsule. The lid, yellowed and brittle, had once held boots from a trip to Montreal in 1987. Now, it held something far more valuable. Unopened statements, dusty stock certificates, and a faded letter from James, her late husband, dated April 1993. She read it twice. I know it seems like nothing, Lo. A tech startup with no product yet, and a CEO who looks 12, but there's something about the way they talk about the future. It feels inevitable. Let's leave it. Let it grow. Someday, we'll be glad we did. James had attached the statement from the initial investment, $9,000 in a fund tied to a company called Stellar Horizon, back when no one had heard the name. Lorraine unfolded the most recent update, nearly 10 years old, showing full reinvestment of shares. She blinked, and blinked again. Then she reached for the phone. Her financial advisor, Paula, was retired now, but she still handled select clients, and Lorraine had been one of them for 3 decades. They met in Paula's kitchen, surrounded by the smell of fresh cinnamon rolls and aging tulips on the windowsill. You know, Paula said, flipping through the printouts Lorraine had brought, I don't usually use the phrase life-altering, but, Lorraine, She turned the screen toward her. You've got over $4.3 million across the reinvested holdings, and that's before we factor in compounding and the valuation from their latest split. Lorraine didn't speak for a full minute. Then, finally, can it be moved quietly? Paula nodded. Very. I'll build you a blind trust and we'll move it in tranches. No red flags, no headlines. Lorraine leaned back, the faint scent of sugar and ink heavy in the air. Then let's begin. By the following week, Lorraine had 3 things: financial leverage, legal standing, and something even more potent: tenant loyalty. The letter titled, "What They Didn't Tell You," had traveled fast through the building. Residents made copies for neighbors. Lorraine found thank you cards slipped under her door. Then came something unexpected. At the community board near the mailboxes, someone had pinned a handmade button. "Thank you, Lorraine." Beneath it, a dozen others soon appeared. Some were drawn in marker, others made on a printer. By the weekend, nearly every resident wore one, on jackets, bags, and even backpacks. She passed a boy on the stairs who tugged his mother's hand and whispered, "That's the lady from the letter." Nathan and Curtis noticed. The shift in power wasn't loud, but it was visible. The tenants no longer looked at Curtis like a landlord. They looked at Lorraine like a steward. Curtis, ever the strategist, suddenly became complimentary in meetings. Nathan left a bottle of wine on her doorstep, her favorite vintage, mysteriously remembered. When they called to ask if she'd join them for coffee, to talk possibilities, Lorraine said yes. Let them talk. Let them believe. She arrived 10 minutes early to the cafe, wearing a navy wool coat and pearl earrings that had once belonged to James's mother. She asked the hostess for a seat near the back, then waited, half concealed by a planter, with a clear line of sight to the reserved table for 3. Curtis arrived first. Nathan followed. Neither saw her yet. Curtis leaned forward, his voice low but not cautious. "Once she signs, we gut the place in a week. No more delays, no more headlines. We play nice, get the ink, and then we move." Lorraine sat in silence for one more beat. Then she stood, brushed off her coat, and walked to the table. "Gentlemen," she said smoothly, "I believe this is our meeting." Curtis blinked, too slow to mask the color draining from his face. Nathan opened his mouth, closed it again. She sat down slowly and smiled. "I'm happy to discuss the terms, though I should mention I've already transferred the stake." Curtis stiffened. "To who?" Lorraine folded her hands, her voice calm. "To my reactivated LLC, the one registered under my name. Which means, in effect, I've already bought myself out." She paused, then added with perfect softness, "And I'm not signing anything but restoration plans." The terms they drafted had one fatal flaw. They assumed she wouldn't read them. Lorraine walked into the glass-walled conference room with the stillness of someone who'd already decided how the meeting would end. She was dressed in a charcoal gray blazer, the kind that didn't shimmer or demand attention, but carried weight with every seam. Her leather briefcase was small, old, and utterly precise. It clicked open once she was seated, and without saying a word, she laid her own document face down on the polished table. Curtis glanced at Nathan, who gave a nervous half-smile. "We really appreciate you coming, Lorraine," he began. "We think it's time to move forward, amicably." "Forward?" Lorraine asked, her voice light but edged. "From which direction exactly?" Curtis chuckled, sliding a red folder toward her. "We've drafted a settlement proposal, clean, generous, mutually beneficial. You exit gracefully, we continue development, and everyone saves face." Nathan added quickly, "It includes a full buyout and a non-disclosure clause, standard terms. We're even covering legal fees." Lorraine nodded slowly, opened the folder, and pulled out the draft. Silence fell as she began to read, line by line, not skimming. The air conditioning hummed softly above them. Somewhere outside the building, a car alarm chirped, then went quiet. She stopped on the 4th page, tapped a line with her finger. "Clause 14, she said. "Interesting." Curtis leaned back. "Just a basic indemnity clause. Legal housekeeping." "Is that what you're calling it?" she replied, voice still calm. "Because Clause 14 states that in accepting your buyout, I forfeit not just my ownership, But my right to challenge future development on tenant protections. It nullifies my injunction retroactively. Nathan paled. That's not how it was explained to us. I'm sure it wasn't, Lorraine said. She slid the folder back across the table. Either way, I won't be signing. Curtis laughed, short and sharp. You're refusing $1 million settlement over a technicality? Lorraine didn't blink. You call it a technicality. I call it people's homes. Then, with quiet ceremony, she flipped her own document face up on the table. My counteroffer, she said. A full buyback of the South Wing. Market value, no NDA, and continued tenant protections under the original charter. Curtis's smile dropped completely. You're joking. I never joke with paper, she replied. It creases too easily. Nathan wiped his palms on his pants. Lorraine, you don't have the capital to. I do, she cut in. And you know that now. The men stared at her, one in disbelief, the other in quiet panic. She let the silence settle like sediment, watched them shift in their seats, then stood. I came here today as a courtesy, she said. But don't confuse silence with surrender. She tucked her counteroffer neatly back into her briefcase, snapped it shut, and left the folder Curtis had given her untouched on the table. That night, Lorraine was just finishing her tea when her phone rang. It was Marisol, her voice tight and anxious. Lorraine, she whispered, someone slid a paper under our door. It's another eviction notice. This one says, final. Lorraine's breath caught, but her voice remained steady. Did they knock? Say anything? Number just the paper, no envelope, no signature. Don't throw it away, Lorraine instructed. Photograph it. Date it. I'll be there first thing in the morning. After she hung up, she sat back, eyes scanning the darkened room. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. She looked toward the stack of documents on her desk, and then, slowly, back to her phone. This wasn't desperation from Curtis and Nathan. It was retaliation. And they'd just confirmed they had no intention of playing fair. When they can't beat you legally, they try to bury you in paperwork. Lorraine woke to a stack of envelopes on her doorstep, thick, official, and unmistakably intentional. The weight of them felt surgical, as though someone had carefully calculated just how much paper it would take to exhaust a woman's patience. Legal-size envelopes lined with phrases like urgent notice, review required, and action needed immediately, scrawled across the tops in aggressive red ink. She didn't flinch. Instead, she placed them in a neat pile on the kitchen table and turned on the kettle. Curtis and Nathan had stopped pretending to be civil. This was siege warfare by bureaucracy. 2 hours later, she sat across from Dana Ross, her attorney for over a decade. Dana was sharp-eyed, salt-and-pepper-haired, and perpetually over-caffeinated. She scanned the documents while Lorraine sipped tea with steady hands. These aren't just confusing, Dana muttered, flipping through the pages. They're laced with landmine language, hidden contingencies, retroactive clauses. Here, look at this line. Page 7, paragraph 8. They've embedded a clause that forces immediate arbitration if you don't respond within 72 hours. But the clock starts from the document's drafting date, not when you received it. They're setting traps, Lorraine said. Dana nodded. A dozen of them, all tucked under the guise of clarifications. If you miss even one reply, they'll claim breach of procedural compliance. Lorraine reached into her bag and pulled out a leather-bound notebook. Every letter she'd received was cataloged there, time-stamped, photographed, and noted in detail. I'm documenting everything, she said. Dana smiled. Then we're still ahead. By Thursday, the tempo increased. More notices, some contradictory, some absurd. One claimed she owed late property taxes on land she no longer owned. Another accused her of obstructing city development by maintaining an unauthorized garden in the rear courtyard, the flower bed her husband had planted in 1989. She kept the rhythm of her days unchanged. Coffee at 7 a.m. sharp, garden walk at 8 o'clock, tenant check-ins before noon, and every evening she organized the chaos, alphabetized documents, flagged critical lines, recorded every phone call and delivery. They could try to bury her in paper, she'd turn every page into a weapon. On Friday morning, a knock at her door broke the silence of her ritual. She opened it to find a man in a city-issued windbreaker, clipboard tucked under his arm. His badge read Building Safety Division, Inspector M. Alvarez. "Ms. Whitmore?" he asked. "I am," she replied. "Someone filed a concern anonymously, claims of irregular permits and zoning noncompliance on this wing. I'm here to do a spot check." Lorraine didn't blink. "Come in." She led him through the narrow hallway, her footsteps measured. The air smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish. When they reached her sitting room, she gestured to the couch. "Coffee?" she asked. He hesitated. Sure." She poured him a mug, then retrieved a manila envelope from her cabinet and handed it over. "These are the original permits, signed by my late husband. Nothing's been structurally altered since 1996. He opened the folder, scanned the signatures, and furrowed his brow. "These are pristine. Why didn't the other party submit these with their application?" Lorraine's smile was polite but cool. "You'd have to ask the other party." He took another long look through the paperwork, then stood. "They didn't mention your name once," he said quietly, "in any of the documents they gave us." Lorraine lifted her gaze and met his. "But I will now," he added. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Lorraine stood still for a moment, one hand resting on the back of the chair. They wanted her erased. Instead, they had just added her name back to the record. They threw a champagne party for the renovation, before securing a single permit. Flashbulbs popped like fireworks, music thumped low from rented speakers disguised as minimalistic decor. Under a plastic banner that read, "Reimagining the Future, Next Line Development's Groundbreaking Ceremony," Nathan stood with Curtis on a temporary stage in front of the apartment building they had tried to erase her from. Lorraine watched from across the street, seated on a bench beneath the rusting iron street lamp that had survived since the 70s. Like her. She wore her usual tailored coat, a pale blue scarf wrapped loosely around her neck, and held a to-go cup of coffee with both hands. She watched the event unfold without blinking, her eyes unreadable behind lightly tinted glasses. Curtis gripped a gold-handled shovel and beamed at the cameras. "We're not just building a new structure," he said into the microphone. "We're building a new era for this community, one of progress, vision, and vitality." Behind him, a giant rendering of the planned high-rise gleamed on an easel. Gone were the brick balconies. Gone were the modest windows where wind chimes still clinked in the breeze. Gone, too, was the soul. A few feet away from the stage, a young journalist adjusted the strap on his camera and glanced at the envelope someone had handed him earlier. It was thick, labeled only, "Confidential, L. Whitmore." Inside were 23 pages, tenant intimidation notices, forged inspection waivers, emails between Nathan and Curtis discussing acceptable collateral damage if the elderly couldn't be relocated in time. One line read simply, "Once she's out, the rest will fall like domino." By the time Curtis raised his glass to toast the future, the journalist had already uploaded a photo of the letterhead to his social feed. Then the video clip started. Mrs. Pendergrass from Unit 3C, standing next to her walker, telling her story. "They offered me a voucher to leave, with no place to go. I've lived here since '81. The single mom from 2B, they sent 3 different papers in 1 week, all unsigned, all threatening. Unit 4B, Marisol and George, holding their eviction notice in the wind. We didn't even do anything. They just wanted us gone." And then the hashtag was born. Not without Lorraine. It spread faster than Curtis's champagne could spill. One photo of Lorraine sitting on the bench, watching quietly, was reshared with captions like "The real owner watches while the clowns dance" and "She built the foundation they're trying to bulldoze." By 4:30 p.m., 3 local blogs had posted short exposés. By 5 o'clock, the city planning office's phones were jammed. By 6:12, the housing authority's lead investigator called Curtis directly. He didn't answer. So they left a voicemail. "Mr. Weller, we'll need to speak with you first thing tomorrow regarding permit discrepancies and tenant rights violations. Please confirm." Lorraine didn't smile as she crossed the street back to her building. She didn't wave to the onlookers or glance back at the stage where Curtis still posed for photographers, unaware of the digital tsunami heading straight for him. Instead, she walked inside, greeted two tenants in the hallway, and slipped quietly into her unit. There, on her desk, was the notebook where she'd tracked everything: letters received, calls made, permits filed, and the dates she'd visited the clerk's office. She didn't need to update it now. The real update was already happening, in headlines, hashtags, and comment sections she would never read. She poured herself a glass of water, steady as ever, and sat in the living room as dusk wrapped around the windows like velvet. Then the phone rang. It was Dana. "You were right to wait," her attorney said. "The housing board's opening a formal investigation. But that's not the only thing." Lorraine tilted her head, listening. "They're suspending the project pending review, and they're offering you something." She waited. "They want to appoint you as an advisor, city-backed, tenant-approved, a liaison for ethical housing redevelopment." Lorraine exhaled, slowly. From across the room, the file marked "Next Line Internal Memos" seemed to shift under the weight of the moment. She wasn't just back in the picture, she was now the frame. They'd stolen the spotlight, but she'd kept the foundation. Lorraine walked the halls like someone returning to her own skin. The linoleum floors of the south wing still bore the same faint scuff marks from grocery carts, strollers, and decades of footsteps. Unit by unit, she knocked, softly, respectfully. Each time she held a folder in one hand and a gentle reassurance in the other. "I'm not here to scare you," she told them. "I'm here to protect what should have never been taken." In Unit 3C, Mrs. Pendergrass blinked behind thick bifocals, holding a crumpled lease addendum in shaking hands. "They said I was month to month now," she whispered. "Said my old agreement didn't count anymore." Lorraine examined the form. "It's unsigned, and it's illegal," she said. "We'll add it to the file." Dana, her attorney, moved fast once she had the documents. Within 2 days, she filed a motion with the housing court, requesting an emergency stay on all transfer approvals and evictions issued by Next Line Developments. The motion cited evidence of coerced amendments, misrepresented tenancy terms, and unlawful rent escalations. A court date was set, fast-tracked thanks to Lorraine's new advisory role. Curtis tried to get ahead of it. He circulated a formal letter to residents promising clarification sessions and offering small, good-faith rent credits. But Lorraine had already beaten him to it. Her letters weren't printed on glossy Next Line stationery. They were hand-delivered, personally signed, and attached to an invitation. "Join us Saturday. Community forum and legal review session in the garden lot." People came. They brought contracts, phone screenshots, unanswered maintenance slips. Dana set up a small folding table under the oak tree. Lorraine passed out tea and cookies she'd baked that morning. "This isn't about me," she told them. "It's about your right to stay in a place that feels like home." That same weekend, a local news crew arrived. Their interest had been piqued after Lorraine's name surfaced repeatedly in the permit controversy. The reporter, a woman barely 30, introduced herself with wide eyes and a notebook already half full. "We don't want a fluff piece," she said. "We want the truth." Lorraine didn't give a speech. She didn't recount the whole story. She simply looked into the lens and said, "It's not about nostalgia. It's about decency." That was all it took. The clip aired that night. By morning, her inbox overflowed. Former tenants thanking her, ex-colleagues from her teaching years sharing memories, and one message signed only, "Tom D., 4th grade. You taught me how to multiply and how to speak up." Donations began trickling in through a quietly set-up fund by a tenant advocacy group. Not for legal costs, Lorraine had those covered, but for restoring the community garden Curtis had bulldozed in his initial plans. Then came the email. It landed late one evening as Lorraine watered the geraniums in her kitchen window box. The subject line read, "I believe we're connected through the foundation." She opened it cautiously. The sender's name was unfamiliar, Elena Voigt, but her message was anything but. "My grandfather, Victor Voigt, was the original architect of your building. I've been following your story, and I found something in his old files. It's about the original design. And your husband. They worked together more closely than anyone realized. I think it's something you need to see. Lorraine stared at the screen, heart stilled in her chest. She remembered Victor, broad-shouldered, salt-haired, always in linen vests and sketching with charcoal in the courtyard. James used to say, "Victor's blueprints have more heart than some people's vows." Lorraine replied with a single line, "Please call me. I'll be here." She closed the laptop slowly, her reflection faint in the darkened screen. Outside, the wind carried the scent of freshly turned soil. Someone had left a small bouquet of daffodils on her doorstep. No card, just roots wrapped in damp paper, tied with string. The building was breathing again, and now a story long buried beneath the foundation was ready to rise. Buildings hold memory, and sometimes leverage. Lorraine sat quietly at her dining table as Elena Voigt laid out the old architectural files between them like a sacred mosaic. The paper was thick, its edges curled from age, but the blueprints beneath were crisp. Lines drawn in charcoal, annotated in careful cursive. In the bottom right corner, 2 signatures shared space. Victor Voigt, architect, and beside it, James Whitmore, co-developer. Lorraine's breath caught. "My grandfather always said your husband wasn't just a financial partner," Elena explained. "He was the reason the building had soul. He pushed for accessible units, natural light, quiet courtyards. He believed dignity should be structural." Lorraine touched the paper like it was skin. "And this?" she asked, tapping the final page. Elena nodded. "A full historic designation application. Victor drafted it. James was going to submit. But the last note says, 'Postponed until after recovery.' I assume that never happened?" Lorraine didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the hallway where James's walking cane still stood by the closet, untouched. "No," she whispered. "It didn't." By Monday morning, Lorraine and Dana submitted the historic preservation application in person. They included not only the original blueprints, but letters from tenants, photos from the building's early years, and testimony from Elena as a direct architectural descendant. "This is more than nostalgia," Dana told the preservation officer. "It's documented civic intent." The officer, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a quiet reverence for old structures, placed her hand over the stamped receipt. "You may have just stopped a demolition with this." Lorraine exhaled slowly. For the first time in weeks, it felt like something irreversible had begun to shift back into place. Curtis, however, didn't react with relief. He reacted with panic. 2 days after the application was submitted, Lorraine found an envelope at her door. Inside, a typed letter on next line letterhead offering a confidential goodwill resolution, a high 6-figure check in exchange for immediate withdrawal of all public claims and legal proceedings. She read the offer once, then again. Then she lit a match and watched the corner curl orange in her kitchen sink. The ashes fell softly into porcelain like paper snow. The next morning, she posted a message on her tenant bulletin board and online. "There's no price for peace of mind. I'll never sign silence over integrity. L. Whitmore." Within hours, her message had been shared on social media by former tenants, legal advocates, and even 2 council members. Curtis never followed up again. Dana confirmed the next evening what Lorraine already sensed deep in her chest. "It's in process," she said. "Once the historic bid clears preliminary review, the building will be safe from major redevelopment for decades." Lorraine closed her eyes. "James would have liked that. He'd be proud," Dana said gently. "And a little smug." Lorraine almost smiled. He'd have worn his bow tie just to submit the application himself. But the moment of peace was short-lived. That night, as she prepared for bed, her landline rang. The number was blocked. She considered ignoring it, but something in her bones urged her to answer. "Nathan," she said before he even spoke. He didn't waste time. "If you don't back off," he said, voice tight, "I swear I'll go public with what I know." Her silence was immediate and sharp. Nathan continued, "You think you're protecting something noble, but there's more to Dad's files than you remember. You want everything aired out in court, because I will." The line went dead before she could respond. Lorraine stood in the dark, the dial tone humming like static in her chest. She wasn't sure what Nathan had, but she knew one thing with absolute clarity: he wasn't bluffing. There's one thing harder than being underestimated: being betrayed by your own child. Lorraine sat on the edge of her bed, the glow of her desk lamp casting long shadows over the letter tray beside her. The silence after Nathan's voicemail was heavier than the message itself. His voice had held no hesitation, just cold, transactional threat. "If you don't withdraw your application," he'd said, "I'll tell everyone about the trust fund error. You left it mishandled for years, Mom. I've got the records." Lorraine's heart had thudded once, just once, then settled into something harder than fear: clarity. She crossed the room to the cedar filing cabinet, slid open the second drawer, and pulled out a worn manila folder marked J. Whitmore, Audit Plus Revision Notes, 1998. The pages smelled faintly of time and carbon ink. Her late husband's notes were still intact, margins full of his firm cursive. One line was underlined twice in red: "Corrected in April, confirmed by secondary CPA, all reconciled, retain for 20-plus years." It had been a clerical oversight, an outdated rollover form from an investment account James had meant to dissolve but forgot during his treatment. Lorraine had caught it a month later, filed the fix, logged the correction. Not a scandal, not even a hiccup. But Nathan, he was betting no one would know the difference. By dawn, Lorraine had written the truth, not in a press release, not through her lawyer, but in her own voice on a simple WordPress blog she hadn't updated in years. She titled the entry, "What My Son Thinks He Knows." She didn't dramatize, she didn't defend, she simply laid it out. How grief makes room for human error, how she corrected it, and how her son had grown distant, then transactional. She included one scanned page from the CPA file and ended with, "No one is perfect, but transparency is not weakness. It is the strength to say, here is the truth, even when it hurts." She hit publish and went to make tea. By noon, the post had over 70,000 views. Comments flooded in from people she didn't know: women her age, younger professionals, former tenants, even students. Some simply wrote thank you, others shared stories of estranged children, ungrateful partners, legal betrayals. They didn't see a scandal, they saw a survivor. Dana called in the afternoon. "Lorraine, you've just won the court of public opinion." She nodded. "That wasn't the point." "I know, that's why it worked." By midweek, the building's narrative had shifted. Online discussion boards spoke about the ethics of elder erasure. Several tenant rights organizations publicly backed Lorraine's historic bid. 2 city council members shared her blog with the caption, "Experience is not a relic, it's a resource." Curtis panicked. The next day, he resigned from Next Line Developments. His official statement cited creative differences. But Lorraine knew better. A source close to the council leaked the real reason. With mounting pressure and no confidence in the project's legality, Curtis had jumped ship before it sank. Lorraine sat in her living room as the news scrolled across the bottom of her muted television. The building stood quiet behind her windows, still and waiting. But Nathan didn't call. Later that night, she received a sealed envelope slipped under her door. Inside, copies of several loan applications, high-value private loans taken out under Whitmore Holdings LLC. The listed collateral, the apartment building, and the signatures, only Nathan's. Her breath caught. He had faked sole ownership on paper. It all came together. The push for redevelopment, the refusal to acknowledge her stake, the rushed permits, the bluffs, the threats. Nathan hadn't been building a future. He'd been buying time. And now, the bill was due. Lorraine sank into her chair, the folder trembling slightly in her lap. Curtis may have fled, but her own son was still in it, and more desperate than ever. When they fall, they reach for the hand they spent years dismissing. Nathan didn't knock. He stood outside Lorraine's front door for a full 10 seconds before forcing it open with a shaky palm. The screen door slapped behind him as if marking his arrival with a punctuation mark neither of them had chosen. Lorraine was sitting at her small table near the window, where the morning sun filtered through the blinds and landed in stripes across her notebook. She didn't move. He looked older than he had a week ago. paler, worn around the eyes like he hadn't slept, or had done so in fits and starts, curled around guilt he wasn't ready to name. "I didn't know where else to go," he said finally, his voice low and raw. Lorraine didn't offer him a seat. "You took out loans," she said calmly, as if it had been weather she was expecting. "Private ones, using documents that list you as sole owner." He nodded, slowly. "I was going to pay it off as soon as we launched. The renovation was weeks away. And when the city froze the permits?" He swallowed. "I panicked. Not before. Before that, you gambled with something that didn't fully belong to you." Nathan's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his shoulders collapsed inward. "You were never supposed to find out." Lorraine tilted her head, eyes unreadable. "I was never supposed to matter." There was no anger in her voice, just the chilled steadiness of someone who had long since passed the point of outrage and found herself somewhere colder. "You could have come to me," she said. "You could have said, 'Mom, I'm in trouble, I might have helped.' But you assumed. You lied. You forged signatures. You counted on me staying quiet." Nathan's mouth opened, but Lorraine raised her hand. "No more explaining, no more half-confessions." He stood still, breathing shallowly, and then asked, "What are you going to do?" "You have two options," she replied, standing up slowly, her back straight and her chin lifted like steel beneath soft flesh. "Tell the truth, to the public, to the lenders, to the city. Admit what you did, or I move forward with pressing charges." His face twisted, confusion bleeding into disbelief. "You'd really put me in court? Your own son?" "No," she said. "You put yourself there. I'm just acknowledging the invitation." He turned away and stared out the window, his jaw clenched so tightly a vein twitched near his temple. "And if I don't?" he asked, voice now bitter. "If I decide to fight back?" Lorraine walked to the sideboard near her fireplace and picked up a small envelope. She handed it to him. "What's this?" "Documentation of the forgery. Copies of every file you altered. Ready to submit." Nathan looked down at it, then dropped it on the coffee table like it burned. "This is war." She nodded once. "You made it that." He walked out without another word, leaving the door open behind him. The next day, Lorraine was served. A letter delivered by courier, cream paper in an official envelope. She read it without sitting down. "Notice of civil action plaintiff. Nathan Whitmore. Allegation. Emotional distress, reputational damage, undue pressure inflicted by a family member." The accusation was vague. Intentionally so. No dates, no numbers, just language meant to wound in public. She faxed a copy to Dana, then poured herself a cup of tea and stood by the window, watching the wind move through the dogwood tree in her front yard. Her phone buzzed. Dana's voice came through the speaker, clipped and sharp. "He wants noise, headlines. We'll crush it, but it won't be quiet." Lorraine didn't answer right away. She walked into the hallway, opened the linen closet, and pulled down a wooden box she hadn't touched in months. Inside, wrapped in a silk scarf, was a photograph. Black and white. Her and James, standing in front of the building, long before tenants, long before paperwork, just hope and bricks. She held it in both hands. "We started this together," she whispered. Then she set the photo down on her desk, powered on her laptop, and opened the legal file Dana had prepared the week prior. A quiet breath, a focused gaze. Time to finish what we started. Some people buy power, others build it, and then walk in holding the deed. The letter from the Historic Preservation Office arrived in a simple envelope. No embossed seals, no fanfare, just black ink on a single white sheet. Lorraine unfolded it with steady hands, though her pulse beat hard in her throat. Approved. Just one word. But it carried the weight of memory, of the brick her husband laid by hand, of the tenants who had turned apartments into lifelines. The building, now classified as a protected landmark, could not be demolished, split, or gutted, not without a hearing, not without her. She placed the letter gently atop the others: legal motions, public support declarations, the blog post that had garnered thousands of quiet signatures. She reached for her reading glasses and opened one more file, the final purchase bid, This time, the name at the top wasn't Whitmore Holdings. It was Whitmore Legacy LLC, fully reactivated, funded, and fronted by Lorraine herself. By noon, the offer was submitted. Market rate, clean financing, no complications, just a single-sheet summary of her intent to buy the full property, outright. Within 48 hours, the responses came in. 2 minority shareholders, former partners of Nat, Han, who had grown increasingly uneasy, voted in favor of Lorraine's bid. The bank, having reviewed Nathan's recent default notices and legal drama, quietly nudged toward liquidation. The math spoke louder than his charisma ever had. By the end of the week, Lorraine stood in front of the same building Curtis once called ripe for modern conquest. This time, it was hers. She arrived at the courtyard in linen slacks and a soft blue blouse, her hair pulled back in a silver clip that used to belong to her mother. The sun hit the bricks just right, warming them like old bones stirred to life again. Tenants, some in jeans, others in house slippers, had gathered around, word having spread faster than she expected. Lorraine stepped onto the low garden ledge and raised her hand. "I'm not a developer," she said simply. "I'm a caretaker, and I'm here to rebuild, not replace." The group was quiet for a heartbeat. Then someone clapped. Then more. A young mother with a baby on her hip cried. The elderly man from 2A tipped his hat in reverence. Carol brought a jug of sweet tea. Lorraine passed out copies of the new maintenance schedule and renovation outline, clear, handwritten, and entirely transparent. No more whispered notices, no more locked office doors, just plans and people and shared investment. She ended the gathering with a single line, voice calm but firm. "Let's begin repairs. Together." They were still talking when Nathan appeared. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the cement. Lorraine saw him before anyone else did, coming through the alley, suit wrinkled, hair unkempt, briefcase swinging like a prop he no longer knew how to carry. He waited until the group dispersed, then approached. "You forgot one document," he said. Lorraine looked him over carefully. He wasn't angry, not yet, but there was something clenched behind his eyes. Desperation, maybe, or the last sparks of someone trying to rewrite a scene already finished. "I checked every file," she said. "There's nothing left." He opened the briefcase with a snap. Inside, a thick folder labeled Media Rights and Licensing Agreement. "Any press coverage about this project?" he said. "Any potential book or documentary? You owe me a cut." Lorraine didn't laugh. She didn't flinch. She simply reached into her own satchel and pulled out a single sheet. She handed it to him like a final receipt. His eyes scanned the lines, mouth tightening. "You wrote this into the LLC clause?" he asked. She nodded. "Last year, before you tried to erase me." The clause stated, in clear terms, that any public-facing media based on the company's transactions or founding history was protected under sole discretion of the majority stakeholder, her. He looked at her, stunned. "You planned this all along." "No," she said softly. "I protected myself. That's not the same thing." Nathan didn't reply. He just stood there, briefcase in hand, folder forgotten at his side. Lorraine turned toward the building. The lights were coming on now, soft, golden glows in windows that had stood for decades. She didn't look back. Not once. Behind her, Nathan remained in the courtyard, staring at the folder in his hand, realizing for the first time that he wasn't even a footnote in the story he tried to steal. They said her time was over. Instead, she built a better one. The contract slid across the table like a final insult dressed in legalese. Nathan stood in front of her one last time, creased collar, thin-lipped smile, desperation almost polished into confidence. The document was crisp, tucked in a leather folder, labeled Provisional Agreement for Licensing Rights, Narrative and Media Use. "I think it's only fair," he said. "You're going to make something out of this, articles, maybe a film. People are watching. And after all, I was part of the story." Lorraine didn't reach for the folder. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap like she was preparing to deliver a lesson she'd taught 100 times. "You didn't even read your own LLC clause," she said softly. Nathan blinked. She turned to a drawer beside her, pulled out her own copy of the original restructuring document, and laid it on the table between them. Page 5, subsection 7C. You waived all narrative claims the moment you transferred partial control to the reactivated holding under a prior entity. His face tightened. I was advised. By people who didn't think I'd read it twice, she finished for him. But I wrote it. Or rather, I restored what James and I wrote together. 30 years ago. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't gloat. She simply stood and walked to the door. Nathan didn't follow. He stayed rooted in place, staring at the document like he could will it into rewriting itself. She paused before leaving the room. You wanted the spotlight. I wanted the roof to stop leaking. Then she left quietly and never saw him again. A year passed. In that time, the building changed, not just in structure, but in soul. The paint no longer peeled from the baseboards. The hallways smelled of fresh citrus cleaner and blooming lilies instead of dust and decay. The upstairs units had been renovated gently, keeping the wooden molding, the clawfoot tubs, the wrought iron balcony rails that had once been considered outdated, but now felt timeless. Lorraine moved her office into Unit 1A, the apartment she and James had once stayed in when the building was barely livable. Now, the walls were lined with framed black and white photos of tenants from every decade. Teachers, musicians, single mothers, poets, factory workers, veterans. In the courtyard, the oak tree had grown even fuller, spreading shade across hand-built benches. It was under that tree that she held the open house. People came slowly at first. Residents, city officials, curious neighbors. Then, more, former students, colleagues, even a few names she hadn't heard in 20 years. Some brought flowers, others brought stories. Lorraine stood beneath the oak, a microphone clipped gently to her collar, and cleared her throat. I never wanted a plaque, she said, eyes sweeping over the gathering. Or a spotlight. I wanted what my husband wanted, what many of you have wanted for decades. She looked around at the faces before her, old, young, weathered, bright. Not luxury, she continued, not spectacle, just stability, dignity, a place where people can belong without having to beg for it. There was a stillness in the air, broken only by the rustle of the leaves above. She smiled. The best revenge, she said, isn't power. She paused. It's purpose. The rest of the afternoon passed in warm light and soft conversation. Children chased bubbles. A violinist in Unit 3C played quietly from her balcony. Plates of cookies disappeared from a long folding table draped in a handmade quilt. Lorraine walked the halls slowly, her palm grazing the railings, the memories flooding her senses in waves that didn't sting anymore. Each door she passed had a new story behind it, and she had helped keep those stories alive. As she rounded the last corner, a girl, no older than 7, came bounding down the hallway. She wore a yellow sundress and mismatched sneakers. She paused when she saw Lorraine and tilted her head. "Are you the owner?" she asked, wide-eyed. Lorraine crouched slightly so they were eye-level, her smile slow and deep. "Yes," she said, "but more importantly, I'm the caretaker." The girl nodded, satisfied, then took her hand without asking and pulled her into the courtyard, where sunlight poured like honey through the trees, and laughter echoed off the walls Lorraine had once feared would collapse. Not anymore. Not ever again.